Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I gather you all read that this is an English-speaking evening.
Yeah.
Are there any objections then? I would like to hear them now.
Otherwise we do it in French.
Okay.
Although...
and as for starters, let me ask, seeing this interesting audience, how many of you are from the United States?
No Americans here today?
No Americans here?
James, where are you?
No? All solid Dutch citizens? Okay.
Yeah.
In that case, we'll have to change the program slightly. But good evening again. This is an evening about Trumpland, or otherwise known as what's happening to America. We won't be talking about Trump all evening, more, as I hope, about America. But I'll give you the order of things. First, there's a section in which I will interview Willem Post. Willem Post is known as an Amerika-kenner and the author of this recent book, America's Mirror, The Spiegel van Amerika, which you can, of course, buy at the book table. Then, after a short interview with Willem Post, I will ask two guests to join me on stage. Guests that I will introduce to you later on as the moment comes. Final message of the order is to please shut down your telephones. May be hard to do because Willem just told me that there's breaking news from the United States. Yeah. Don't know if you've heard it already, but being that the FBI has reopened the investigation into the emails of Hillary Clinton. Yeah. What might that mean, Willem?
Well, this could easily be, well, the mid-October or late October surprise, just 11 days before Election Day. And, well, Mr. Trump already, there was already a rally of Mr. Trump I think in some of the Midwestern states, and he brought this fantastic news for him, and there was a loud uproar of people standing ovation now for Trump. And
do you think this will be a game changer?
Well, that could be. We will see. It's still rather vague. Well, really the latest news is, I just checked, that the FBI found some mails that they could link to the earlier investigation to the Clinton mails, but those mails were already released by the Clinton campaign, so that could be helpful for the Clintons. But anyway, the reopening of this investigation is bad news for the Clinton campaign.
Okay, well, and is it, okay, right. We'll get back to that later on. First, I gather all of you know Willem Post from his work. Willem is a long-time Amerika-kenner. He's working at the Klingendahl Institute.
Yes, I'm associated with Klingendahl.
Okay, and since I was reckoning that there would be many Americans in the audience today, I was hoping that Willem could explain what exactly is an Amerika-kenner.
Yeah.
Amerika-kenner is a rather recent term in Dutch journalism. It's mainly, now I'm starting to give the answer myself. But
well, you're a journalist.
it's mainly not an academic position. No. It's a journalistic position. Yeah. It's not an expert. It's what we in Holland call a kenner, like you have a kunstkenner. Yeah. But is an Amerika-kenner something like a kunstkenner?
Well, there is a development in the... I studied American history and politics at Leiden University. And my professors in those days, in the 70s and the 80s, were rather famous, more than well-known, let's say famous professors.
Who were they?
Professor Lammers and Professor Sjoerd de Jong, experts on FDR and Woodrow Wilson. And Professor Sjoerd de Jong wrote a book about Woodrow Wilson that was also published in the United States, so very well respected, those Leiden professors. And in the 80s, it was the first time that academics on television, on Dutch television in this case, gave their commentary. There was also a guy from Utrecht, Professor van Rossum, but he's also a very colorful, almost journalist-like person. So he gave, well, very, very, what shall I say, intriguing comments on Dutch television, making a lot of jokes. And because television is rather artificial, populist, that helped. And from that day on, they asked on Dutch television, and so background programs, like the McLaren show in the US, but here, well, the background programs like Netwerk and Eén Vandaag, Dutch television programs, giving background news, and they asked Dutch academics. But because most of the academics preferred to stay in the university, there was some room for people like Markha Valenta, who himself was a professor, and for myself as a formal historian, but also on television. And then the gates were opened.
Gates were open. You started out in the 70s, I think.
Well,
a long time ago.
I studied in the 70s, early 80s, and then in the mid 80s I had my first Dutch television performance, because it's television. So then it all started. Now we have 25 or 30 well, what shall we say, America watchers?
I walked in from Central Station, and you can see it in the bookshop over there, and also on the book table over there. We have a book of Guus Valk, our correspondent of my newspaper.
He's a journalist, eh?
Yep. I forgot to introduce myself, by the way, but never mind.
Guus,
Twan Huis, also a book out on the Clintons. So you say yourself the gates are open. Are there too many Amerika-kenners?
Well, it depends how you see it.
Are there 12 million Amerika-kenners, maybe?
No, you know, well, yes, basically all of us, we're all watchers. There's not a real distinction anymore, but you have to understand that if you're focusing only on the campaign, what Mr. Twan Huis is doing, basically, and Mr. Charles Groenhuizen, not about foreign policy or security policy, it's about the campaign. That's 2 of the 4 years, and it's a very good business, because the Dutch are addicted. This is a show, especially now with, it's always the greatest show on earth, but now especially with Mr. Trump, there are theaters full of people paying tickets for 10, 20, 30 euro. Well, you're here also now, but it's a little bit different tonight. You will experience this. Yeah. So it's a good business.
Okay. So what gives an Amerika-kenner his special expertise, which you can't have if you, for instance, take a holiday in the United States each year?
Yeah, well,
what's the big difference?
Well, of course, I also use the internet. And then I'm in the same league as all of the Dutch who are using the internet. But if you have as a background your university study, archive research, doing this for Klingendahl, that could be the difference. But you are completely right, especially on television. If you are a good talker, you use the internet, you're only focused on the campaigns. And Mr. Twan Huis and Mr. Charles Groenhuizen, they are very good journalists. And Ilko Bosch van Rosenthal. So, and if you can film and storytelling and report, then basically you are still a journalist, but also a bit behaving like, well, I'm an America expert. So it's a free society.
It has something strange to have Amerika-kenners while everybody knows America that well.
Yeah, the Dutch. Yeah.
Are all Amerika-kenners Democrats?
Well, I should say so, yes, because there is not a strong tradition of real conservative politics in the Netherlands, so that's lacking. So what we have in the Republican Party for a long, long time, not only now, but the conservative wing of the Republican Party, you cannot compare that with the VVD or even the Christian Democrats. So we are more center-oriented in the Netherlands, and well, in the 60s, 70s, and maybe a little bit later also, we have some sort of a progressive orientation. That's changing now, of course.
But if, as you say, most or all Amerika-kenners are Democrats, are they biased?
Well, you know, that's television, and if you want to perform in the talk shows, like Pauw in the Netherlands or De Wereld Draait Door, even if you are English-speaking, maybe you've heard of these very popular programs, that's not about nuances. If you want to perform, to act in a talk show, you have to make statements, opinions. So that is also my criticism, not so much on those talk shows, because that's the way it is, but if you're only acting in talk shows, then it's about your opinion. And for instance, and it's not so easy, because if you ask my opinion about Trump, I will start with the facts. And on Dutch television, in an early morning program, the breakfast show, months ago, I gave the answer to a question, and I said, well, Mr. Trump he has a crazy behavior. And the interviewer was a bit shocked. I said, wow, early in the morning, so you say he's crazy. Well, and I said, well, look, if you act like Mr. Trump, this is not my opinion, this is a fact. Based on the facts, what he is saying, ridiculing handicapped people, insulting the women, the Mexican, well, you all know those stories. So that's strange, even crazy behavior, but that's based on facts.
But is he right?
yeah, you're never right if you're ridiculing handicapped people.
No, but for instance, do you think Amerika-kenners or the media in Holland have given Trump a fair shake in their coverage?
Well, I wrote this book.
We'll get to the book.
I wrote this book with Hans Veldman, who sadly enough, after a long disease, passed away a few weeks ago. And I have Hans also in my mind now, because Hans was one of the few American experts who constantly said, well, Dutch journalists, but also we America experts, we are too much focused on the East Coast, on New York, Washington, that whole area. There's also that other America, the Midwest and the South. And Hans pointed to Barry Goldwater already in the early 70s, early 60s, early 60s, I have to say, because then you already saw the rise of conservatism in the United States, and a lot of people missed it in the Netherlands. Yeah. It was wishful thinking.
Okay.
Yeah?
What's the point of the new book? The main point that you're trying to make about the elections now?
Well, the main point is that this anger, and it was already written, of course, this year ago, 1.5 years ago, we started with this, and we saw this anger. And the basic message of the book is, please don't underestimate this extreme anger in the Midwest and the South. Well, we all see what's happening now. Don't underestimate this whole phenomenon. You can say on the one hand, Trump is crazy or acting like a crazy person. Maybe it's all an act, but still, if you're acting constantly in this way, then, in my opinion, that's okay. There you go. Then it's really crazy.
What do you think will happen? I will read a short sentence from the book in English, so you'll have to check up on me if I twist the meaning, because it's of course in Dutch. You say the new president will inherit a country with unprecedented polarization, and will have to channel anger like never before. Yeah,
that's really true.
Is that the message for Trump or Clinton?
Yeah, because we are used to polarization since many years. Maybe it already started. Well, I mentioned Barry Goldwater in the early 60s, but well, there was some sort of an acceleration with Ronald Reagan. This whole also anti-Washington sentiment, and Ross Perot and George W. Bush, the Texas president, who, well, yeah, you know it.
But this is worse?
And I think it's now really worse. And it has to do with, I think, two very important developments, especially the older Americans. They were raised in the American century, when the US could say, well, we are the victors of the Cold War and the First World War, the Great War, the Second World War, sadly enough, Vietnam. But, well, look at the First Gulf War. That was also a victory for the United States. Every generation, especially in small-town America, has a lot of soldiers in the army. So there is a very proud tradition. And if you are raised in that American century, and now, in 2016, you have an invisible enemy you cannot beat in 1 or 2 or 3 years, not like the First Gulf War or other wars.
So it's a feeling of impotence.
Yeah, and especially impotence. It's a cocktail. It's about people feeling insecure. But the economy, I think, is the leading subject.
That's the second one.
And that's the second one, because these same, to generalize, older white people in small-town America, in the old days, they had factory jobs in those small towns. Not a lot of people were farmer, only 4 or 5%, also 20 or 30 years ago. And so a lot of people worked in the service sector or in the factories. And Brookings, we are mentioning that a report from Brookings Institute recently published that since the 1990s, millions and millions of jobs, especially in the Rust Belt, the Midwest, and also the South, were lost and gone to China. And these same people, they are not connected with the whole rise of IT, the startups, the youngsters, Silicon Valley, Austin, those fantastic places now. So they're living in poverty. And if they have a job, they work at McDonald's for 1/5 of what they earned when they work in the factory. And if you had a factory job, you were in the US a middle-class person, because you...
And that's gone.
They had a good salary.
But I read somewhere that the average income of the Trump voter is $70,000. You mean maybe another figure which is not accurate?
It's also a fact that if you study the people who are now supporting Donald Trump, that's also a whole group of people who still have a job, but they see around them that this is the first generation of youngsters, well, their kids, their grandchildren, who are not...
Will be in decline.
Yeah, and that's basically it's the first time that you see that a generation of their children and grandchildren can't make it. And don't forget that till 2008, in the 90s, but till 2008, it was almost paradise. The economy was booming, booming, booming. If you want to check this, please read the statement President Clinton gave when he went out of the White House. Basically saying, what we are now seeing in the US, it's incredible. No big wars, stability, economy is booming, booming, booming. The longest economic growth period in US history. The housing market through the roof. The stock market, you hear it Bill Clinton saying, with his charming voice, through the roof. Every economic indicator is green. We've never seen this before, Bill Clinton said when he walked out of the White House. That's only 15 years ago. So a lot of older people thought, well, in those days, the Reagan years, the Clinton years, the American century, it was so much better than then.
Okay. So final question. Does that mean that the American dream is dead, like Donald Trump's saying?
No, I think the US is always, the US is built on a dream. And you can say for quite a few people it's now a nightmare. But change can happen. But to be honest, it's a scary situation. Okay. A lot of Americans, even in depressed circumstances, still believe, well, in 1 or 2 or 3 years, individualism, then it will be better. We will see, but don't forget that 8 years ago, also a lot of people were very, very angry, anti-Bush, anti the war. Then there was hope. Obama brought hope as the new messiah. The Pew Research Center in Washington came with these numbers. Now, it's the same percentage, it's 80%, 75, 80%. Also saying, well, the US is going into the wrong direction. But now it's not hope, what Obama brought, it's anger, where Trump is playing with, exploiting this. And that's a real difference. But don't forget that you always have 2, 3, or 4 Americas. And Obama, it sounds like a contradiction, but there are several Americans. Obama is the most popular one, if you compare him. In the book we write a chapter about Hillary, chapter about Trump and Sanders, and a farewell chapter on Obama. This guy is the most popular now. That says also something about that other America seeing progress in very complicated times.
So you don't see only anger, but also hope.
No, but what are we doing in the media?
Yeah.
News is many, many times about the bad developments. You also are seeing now the economy is picking up.
Okay. Well, Trump's figures are picking up as well. So
yeah, so that's the 2 Americas.
Okay, Willem, thanks very much for this introduction. The book is De Spiegel van Amerika, America's Mirror. And we'll get deeper into the things you said with our next 2 guests.
I have to make a statement, because do we have to make a statement?
The statement was, is the American dream dead?
Okay,
your answer was,
let's do that.
No.
Okay.
I think.
Well, I'm curious to know.
Okay, thank you. Let's have a hand for Willem.
Okay, thanks.
And please stay in the audience to take part in the discussion. Next, we have 2 guests for you, 2 American Amerika-kenners. And I will interview them on their respective views on the election. And after maybe 20 minutes, there's plenty of room for your questions. If you have a very urgent question, of course, you can stand up and shout. It is an election, after all. But if you have more quiet questions, please save them up for the discussion part. Then I would like to ask Markha Valenta and James Kennedy to come forward and take your seats. And I'll introduce them. Many of you will already know these 2 speakers. Many of you won't know, I think, where they're from exactly. Markha's from New Mexico originally, right?
Originally,
yeah. And James is from, as you might know, Iowa. And for a short introduction, I won't mention their ages, but because they're both historians, I'll stick to numbers. Markha's from 1967. She is an historian at the Radboud University in Nijmegen at the Department of American Studies, right? So, American expertise. She also publishes at Open Democracy, for instance, and writes about globalization and multiculturalism as well. James Kennedy is from 1963, so there's a slight age difference. He's an historian as well, and you are probably familiar with his work. He's been a professor of history in Amsterdam and at both universities, I think, right. The University of Amsterdam and the Free University. And he's presently serving as Dean of the University College Utrecht. Two of his most well-known books are Nieuw Babylon in Aanbouw, about Dutch renewal, and Een Weloverwogen Dood, about the Dutch euthanasia law. He also writes a weekly, or bi-weekly?
Every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks, a column for Trouw. Okay, let me start by picking up something that Willem Post said about the media in Holland and Amerika-kenners. How do you both, as Americans, feel about the coverage Dutch media have been giving the electoral process? Since we're now at the eve, on the eve of, I was going to say on the eve of destruction, but that's a pop song, right? On the eve of one of the most important elections in American history, as they say. How have you experienced, how have you found this experience from the Dutch perspective, as Americans?
Well, I would say that I see Dutch media following mainstream American media. So that is to say, the themes that they tend to develop over there is the kinds of issues that they tend to be very, very quick in essentially echoing some of those themes and issues. So in that sense, a really truly independent stance, or one that actually is more focused or changed by the Dutch perspective, is something that I don't see very much of. So that's something that, so in that sense, surprise. I used to notice more difference, that there'd be more kind of an independence in the Dutch media stance toward what went on in the United States. That, but now it seems that the same media logic, the same kinds of stories that are covered there, are covered here.
Okay. Can I translate that as you're saying that the Dutch media are less critical of Hillary Clinton than they were critical of, for instance, Ronald Reagan or George Bush?
Well, certainly. I mean, I don't, it's, you know, actually I don't think that there is a particular, I think also there's a parallel there that, well, there are two things I could say. First of all is that I think that there is not a particular level of enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton in the Dutch media, just as I don't think there's any particular enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton in the American media. No. So I think in that sense there is a kind of a direct, the same sentiments are evident in both sides of the Atlantic. I think that you would have had I think there would have been a much more decided ideological stance about the American elections, indeed, in the elections of 1980, in respect to Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter. Then I think there would have been, the Dutch would have had their own stance on the world, their own views about what role America should play, and that was more decided at a time when the Dutch were more ideologically engaged and more in a position to take their own stance on America's place in the world.
Yeah, that was a Cold War phenomenon, maybe.
Cold War, in part also because I think that, partly because of the Cold War, but not exclusively because of the Cold War, that the ideological commitments of the Dutch were more strongly felt and more assertively articulated than is now possible.
Okay. Do you agree, Markha?
Yeah, I mean, I think how I mostly see it is in terms of my students and my audiences. And what strikes me the most is, I think, especially if I'm thinking about adult audiences, is just sort of the sense of shock at Trump. You know, I was talking with somebody from one of the political parties who invited me to give a talk, and he said, "Well, you know, just explain, you know,
which party
what
was that?
From a Labour Party," and saying, you know, we were talking about, well, what should we talk about? And so one of the first questions is just explaining to the audience, you know, what in God's name is going on. you know, in godsnaam, wat gebeurt er? Hoe kan het dat Trump you know, is getting into this position? So a sort of sense of shocked disbelief and a very strong sense that sort of things are out of control, you know, that the Americans, ze hebben hun zaakjes niet goed op orde. Kind of that sense of that there's a kind of disorder that, you know, is disillusioning or frightful or unsettling. So I think that, and in that way, it seems to me like it's in a certain sense, what I miss then in the Dutch news is, you know, really conveying, I mean, anger starts to get at, but, you know, how is it that Trump could be someone who is deeply appealing to a large section of America? And I miss that.
Do you have the same experience with your students?
Sure.
Which are Dutch students?
Well, and it's when I go around and give talks to different kinds of publics. Certainly, the Dutch students have it. My Dutch students have that. I think Dutch adults in general have this this idea of how could this be possible? How is this? So they also regard it as shocking. So in that sense, it parallels what Markha says. And of course, you know, one of the questions maybe that we haven't raised is, you know, which media, you know, are we talking about? I talk about the mainstream media. There are other American media outlets that don't have their analog here in the Netherlands. In that sense, you can say the way that the Dutch get their news is different than Americans can get their news.
More from mainstream media.
Well, that's right. I mean, you know, you can think about, you know, one of the amazing things in media. Of course, Willem Post talked about many reasons why things have changed, and those were actually excellent analysis. One of the things that's, of course, also changed very much is the American media landscape. Even in the last year and a half. The rise of Breitbart News is something that's astonishing.
Breitbart News is one of the main.
Breitbart News is, in fact, the head of the news of Breitbart News is now Donald Trump's election campaign manager. So in that sense, there's a very, very close relationship between them, and there's a symbiotic relationship has been traced between the rise of Breitbart News in the United States, which used to be a relatively small part of the market share, and the rise of Donald Trump. So these things go together, and we're talking about, you know, that maybe 15% or more of Americans get at least some of their news from Breitbart, which is a more or less fact-free version of news.
So was Trump partly created by the media, in your opinion?
Sure, absolutely. So Trump is created also by this media source, and so he derives his strengths from it. And the rise of both are inconceivable without the other.
Okay.
Yeah, because I just think it's important to add, I think that it's the same is true on the other side too.
The Clinton side.
The Clinton side, the Bernie Sanders side, the even more left side. And so two things. One is I think that my sense is that there's much less attention here to sort of the deep kind of aversion among some portions of the American left to the close ties between Clinton and the establishment, and sort of this aversion to the establishment, and how seriously people were taking Bernie Sanders. So my sense is that people here, the mainstream news sort of felt like, oh, he's just a whack job, you know, he's saying, you know, free.
So he was underestimated, his appeal.
So I think he was underestimated, but you also have things like Democracy Now!
Just a follow-up question about the media before we turn to the Trump phenomenon for real. You said about Dutch media that they weren't very independent in the coverage of this campaign and the rise of Trump. Is that surprising given the fact that we in Holland have had, of course, we have Fortuyn, we have Geert Wilders, which are also kinds of populist politicians who, in any case, Fortuyn was a major shock to the establishment. Does that compare to Trump, and would you expect from Dutch media that they have learned from this experience and would be able better to describe the rise of Trump, or are the differences too big?
No, I think that, I mean, people are, I think, shocked at the excesses of what is said in the Donald Trump campaign. I don't think that they are so particularly surprised or shocked at the pattern of what is called populism. I think that the Dutch media were relatively quick to recognize that Donald Trump was a part of an international pattern of populism, and were able to place him in that context. So in that sense, they saw that relatively and readily, relatively early on, and readily saw the connection. So that did help them place it, and I think that's been part of the framing. You know, that right-wing populism is manifesting itself all over the place, and now also in 2015, 2016 in the United States. So I think that is part of the narrative that comes to the fore.
Okay, so now we're getting at an analysis of populism. And do you think that the rise of Trump is comparable in any way to what we had with Fortuyn, or maybe Wilders, but in any case Fortuyn?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing internationally. So, for example, I also look at India, and you also have the rise of Modi there. So I think or Duterte, right, happening in the Philippines. Yeah. So I think there's a number of countries that we can point to where you see the rise of a certain kind of democratic populism, right? So also Erdogan in Turkey, right? He has a huge democratic mandate in the sense of the support of a wide spectrum of the population. And there's, you can have a complicated analysis about what's going on, but you have the ways in which social media is functioning, that this is really changing how our politics are working. You have the ways in which globalization is working. So we're seeing that in different countries they're facing these shared challenges, and so even though these countries are very, very different, at the same time you have these shared responses, and I think the important thing is that they learn from each other too. So for example, now Trump, right, again going back to India, Trump in the US has there's a contingent of Modi supporters from India in the United States who are very, very pro-Trump.
Are they American citizens? Or?
Some of them they're American citizens, or they have green cards, right? So many of them are working in IT and technology and highly educated. So they're the upper middle class. These are very successful Indians who've gone to the United States to study and to work. And precisely because they see, there's parallels between Modi and Trump in terms of a strong man who at the same time promises economic growth, and at the same time is also bucking the system and is, rebelling against the establishment in terms of, different kinds of aspects. So these kinds of rebellions against the establishment, which are enabled in part by that we have these new media that bypass established media and that shake up existing political structure and elite, you see that happening in many different places.
It's a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll get deeper into the specific American characteristics of Trumpism, or the Dutch characteristics of Fortuyn, or whatever. And maybe you can do that after showing us one of the fragments that you chose for tonight. We have two fragments, two pieces of film, which Markha and James have chosen to illustrate from their personal point of view what's happening in America. And the fragment you chose is about American populism, or a certain style of politics which dates from way before Trump. So if we can have that fragment, it's about 3 minutes, I think. And if you can start the screen, we'll take a look.
In the 1970s, the nation's economy had hit the skids. An energy crisis meant long lines at gas stations, and inflation was eating away at workers' paychecks. Then, Californians received their property tax bills.
Dolores McCormick last year had to pay $646. This year, it's $1,072.
And the state has become an octopus. It's just gobbling up all our little homes, that's all.
Howard Jarvis said the reason he got involved in the tax revolt is he once was helping a woman who was really afraid that her property taxes were going to force her out of her home.
Joel Fox started working with Jarvis in the 1970s.
When he went down to the county building with her, according to Howard, she had a heart attack right there in the building. And it really prompted his theme that he was going to follow, and he says, "Death and taxes may be inevitable, but being taxed to death is not inevitable."
California's Constitution allows anyone with enough popular support to put a proposed law on the ballot. Jarvis, a retired businessman, had tried tax-cutting measures before and gotten nowhere. But with voter anger at a boil, Jarvis proposed a bold idea.
It would cut property taxes 60% on the average, limit them to 1% of market value. To the cities and counties of California, it would mean a revenue loss of at least $7 billion.
For many, those cuts were too harsh.
You see, property tax is...
California's governor, Jerry Brown, said the tax cuts would benefit corporations more than homeowners because businesses would receive more of the tax savings.
Brown has campaigned hard against 13, calling it crazy, a bonanza for large landholders and corporations who stand to get the biggest tax savings.
Opponents also pointed out that as a lobbyist for the Los Angeles Apartment Owners Association, Jarvis represented one of the potential big winners. But he countered criticism with a populist message.
After all, the basis of a free country is that government must be limited. And now we've got unlimited government. That brings unlimited taxation. That either brings you into bankruptcy or dictatorship.
So you could tell this guy is not a Hollywood guy. This guy is not a bright and shiny guy.
Tom Hayden was part of a coalition that fought against Prop 13, but he understood Jarvis's appeal.
He was really not the elite. He spoke for people who felt pinched, economically pinched.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
Jarvis found inspiration for his Prop 13 campaign in the 1976 Academy Award-winning film, Network.
The main character, Howard Beale, becomes a television star by getting on television shouting, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." That was Howard Jarvis's modus. He picked up that line and that persona.
I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
Howard Beale's signature line from the movie, "I'm mad as hell," struck such a popular chord that Jarvis used it on the cover of his autobiography, and it became a rallying cry for the Prop 13 movement. Prop 13 struck a nerve with voters.
They rolled the dice. The elites told them that this would be a catastrophe, and people just didn't care.
They want to see politicians punished and spending cut.
On June 6, 1978, Proposition 13 won in a landslide.
We, the taxpayers, have spoken. We have made clear our goals. Now, we are watching you. It is your responsibility to make Proposition 13 work.
The state got the message.
Okay, that was a short clip about the Proposition 13 movement in California to cut taxes by popular vote. Why did you want to show this piece of film, and what does it mean for today?
Well, I think there's a number of things. One thing that I find that I think is very important is to just have a sense of the ways in which Trump actually is coming out of a particular American tradition. So you can have, there's different reasons to have a sense like he is a very new phenomena. We've never had anything like this. There's good reasons to think that certain things happening with our system, our political system, in fact, are very distinct for the current moment. But in terms of the kind of role that Trump is playing, right, it's built on a strong American tradition of certain kinds of populism that are paired with, a strong distrust of government, much stronger than, you tend to have here in the Netherlands, even now. So you have a strong distrust of government, strong argument for the need for small government, the fact that some kind of outsider to the system comes in and fights for the common man, in particular the common man who's under economic pressure. If you look historically also, you've seen that populist movements sort of coming from the right have been quite common at moments of economic crisis. So there's a number of reasons, but just to have that sense of the deeper historical.
So isn't that true?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what Markha says is very important, that you talk, there's a long history here, it's a long tradition of populism rising up, that it's essentially not led by elites, but it comes from, there's been room for these movements, people who felt pushed to the wall. And American history, going back to the 19th century, early parts of the 20th century, have expressed these kinds of movements. So there's a very long tradition, and those traditions are actually strongest regionally in those areas where Trump is now strongest.
Okay.
So that's something that's, but the only thing I would say that's maybe a difference with Jarvis, and what you also see, populism feels a deep ambivalence often, and it's not about necessarily being anti-government, it's about being anti-elite. And I think one of the things we can say also about, I would not characterize the Trump movement as being anti-government.
He proposes a kind of welfare state.
Yeah, that's right. So in some sense, it's a kind of return to, you know, and again, as it's often been said, what Trump voters want is a government that does something for them.
Yeah.
And that's what they feel. They don't feel government is working for them.
Okay, so is that a kind of convergence between the American and European populism? Because European populism is also very much in favor of the welfare state.
Yes,
early pension.
That's right. So you can say that this is very much, in that sense, Trump is much closer than Jarvis is to the kind of style of populism that you see, that it's really about, it's maybe about having the state reallocate its resources from newcomers and people who are regarded generally as undeserving, and rechanneling those resources in the people who deserve to get them, namely the people who are angry.
But I think you're making a much clearer statement about what his position is than he himself does.
No, I'm talking about Trumpism then about, I'm not talking about what Donald Trump thinks, because I don't know what Donald Trump thinks. I don't know if anybody knows exactly what Donald Trump thinks. He doesn't have a coherent policy in many cases, but I do think there is this idea that in voting him, they will have a protector, somebody who will have government work to their benefit. And I think that one of the things I think lots of Republican commentators have said about the most astonishing feature and the most striking feature about the support for Trump is that there had always been the assumption that many Republican voters were actually anti-government. And what Trump showed them, to their surprise and sometimes to their dismay, is that many of the Republican voters were not anti-government.
Okay, but they want the government to work for them.
For them.
Okay. Markha, would you agree? What's you just put Trump in a long tradition, which I don't know if that's reassuring or not, but what would
we've survived until now, right? So even
what would you call the big difference? James says the attitude towards government involvement in a person's lives. What do you think is the big difference between Trump and earlier versions of American populism? If there is any big difference that you want.
I should just clarify, I think that the difference between Trump and Jarvis, I think there have been all kinds of populist movements also in the late 19th century, early 20th century, during the great economic crisis of the 1890s, and again in the 1930s, that these Americans also wanted government to do more for them. So populism has often been about, you know, I want a fair shake and I want the government to ensure that.
Yeah, I mean, I think something in addition that's important to Trump is the ways in which now it's playing out in terms of lines of educational divide. So the fact that upper educated people with a college degree, right, are much more strongly for Hillary Clinton, and people without a college degree are stronger for Trump. You see that particularly if you're looking at white men. I think that's also very important, the strong gender component. It's a very visible component, and it's tied to a very different set of problems, because if you ask people, if you want to look at sort of what the defining factor is for somebody who's going to support Trump, then even more important than education is that sense of not being heard. If you ask, are you unrepresented, are you unheard in the American? If somebody answers yes, it's an even stronger indicator than education. And I think you have to see that in combination with a very concrete fact. I know this is an important point, though, is that there's a real epidemic now among lower educated white men who are in epidemic proportions, who are committing suicide.
They die earlier.
they kill themselves. When you're hearing statistics about gun violence in America, a significant portion of that gun violence is self-inflicted. It's people killing themselves. And in particular, lower educated white men above 50, so just, you know, past the prime. There's a huge problem with addiction to prescribed medication. Now there's also heroin addiction that's sweeping through these communities. So there's a very, very significant problem going on, and in particular with these lower educated white men who don't feel represented or feel challenged by the changes.
They're falling back, because I gather, I don't know if it's true, if you can confirm that America is a better educated country than it was 30 or 40 years ago, all over.
There are more people with university degrees.
So those white voters
I'm hesitant to say that means better educated, but
that was my.
But anyway, but yes,
that's right. Yeah. Well, we'll get deeper into that after we show another fragment. That's the fragment that James Kennedy chose, and it will bring us to quite a different topic about Donald Trump. So, if you could please show, it's a much shorter fragment.
God for forgiveness.
The question is, have you asked God for forgiveness?
I'm not sure I have. I just go and try and do a better job from there. I don't think so. I think if I do something wrong, I think I just try and make it right. I don't bring God into that picture. I don't. Now, when I take, you know, when we go in church and when I drink my little wine, which is about the only wine I drink, and have my little cracker, I guess that's a form of asking for forgiveness. And I do that as often as possible because I feel cleansed, okay? But, you know, to me that's important. I do that. Okay. But in terms of officially, I could say absolutely, and everybody, I don't think in terms of that. I think in terms of let's go on and let's make it right.
James Kennedy, what do you gather from this fragment theologically, but also societally about America?
Societally, I think what it shows a number of things is in the first place is that we, certainly when it comes to the Republican Party, we've sort of always thought about the Republican Party as a party of God, you know, that this is the party that really thinks this is very important, that particular kinds of traditional pieties are important to say, that you have to show that you know how to walk that walk, and that's something that Donald Trump is not doing here. And I think that indicates, I mean, there's a kind of a religious language, but, you know, for example, it would have been shocking historically for people to say, you know, that you would get evangelicals voting for Donald Trump after he said, I don't need to ask for forgiveness. If a Democrat had said that, or anybody had said this, would have been seen as being beyond the pale. And now that's no longer beyond the pale.
But what's he saying exactly? I don't need forgiveness, or?
That's right. I don't need forgiveness. I don't make mistakes that I have to ask forgiveness for. He is saying, well, you know, I maybe feel cleansed if I do this thing, but it's all very roundabout. So he's not really saying that he needs forgiveness. And the other thing, of course, that's where he got a lot of criticism about, but it really doesn't seem to matter, is, you know, sort of talking about communion in ways that are sort of almost, you know, drinking my little wine and having my little cracker, you know, not very sacramental understanding of what he's doing. So that there is this kind of, so it shows also in some sense the theological novice, somebody who's not familiar talking, as the Dutch would say, the tale canons. And so this is something, so I think it's also showing a kind of a mode, and something I also want to show is that I think what a lot of people who have some kind of church connection, well, they're not really they're maybe because of their anger and because of their frustration, they're no longer demanding, as they used to do, some kind of sign of personal piety. What they really want now is a protector, somebody who will stand up for them and be a bully on their side. And they don't want somebody who follows the pieties of the past and follows that format, but actually is you know, somebody who will just simply fight for you, even if it's a person who hasn't asked for forgiveness and doesn't really understand anything about traditional religion.
So Jimmy Carter wouldn't make it in 2016? No,
and I think, you know, that there's, that's right, Jimmy Carter won in 1976 in part because of his evangelical faith, and that he was able to make a case for that. I think George W. Bush did the same thing in 2000. I think you can sort of say that seems to be that maybe Jimmy Carter kicked that off, and maybe I think it was also an issue with Barack Obama about where he stood in this respect. And one of the interesting things here is that you're finding is that it doesn't seem to matter with Trump. We can also say as a corollary is that, also Hillary Clinton is also not somebody who does much with this publicly. We know she carries a Bible in her purse, and we know that she reads from it daily, but that's not something she's likely to let you know about.
Probably Huma Abedin carries the Bible or not.
That's quite possible, yes.
I should say, I don't know if you want this publicly known, but you wrote about it, that you're a member of the same church as Donald Trump is.
Yeah, that's right. We grew up in the same denomination, so we went. So in that sense, yeah, we have this kind of religious connection. That's also something I raise is he went to the church of Norman Vincent Peale, which was a kind of, he wrote in 1952 the book The Power of Possibility Thinking.
Positive thinking.
And so, or positive thinking, I should say. Yeah. And Power of Positive Thinking, and that's just basically a book about self-help, and that that God can be a mantra almost, as it were, for self-improvement, and that's really what his theology was. So and that was in New York City, and I grew up in a different part of the denomination. But I also grew up in the same church as Robert Schuller, the guy from the Hour of Power, and who had much of the same theology as Donald Trump's childhood minister.
Okay, Markha, does that mean that America is becoming less religious, in your opinion? We always talk about America as the most religious country in the world, the most churches anyway, per square kilometers.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Is America?
Well, I think you're having different kinds of developments. So it is true that people who are describing themselves in censuses as not belonging to a church, not affiliated with a formal religious institution, that group is growing very, very quickly. I forget what the latest statistics are, but it's changed like from 5 to 15%.
I think it's
it's getting
22, 23% of the population in the United States.
Pace. So it's going very, very quickly. But it still means something different than in the Netherlands. So a lot of those people still would describe themselves as spiritual, still would describe themselves as believing in God. So it doesn't quite mean the same thing as sort of, it has a bit of a different composition than in the Netherlands, but it's a recent development and it's happening very quickly.
So does that play into the cards of Trump or Clinton? Who profits from this development?
Well, I think because that's the other thing I think that's important is that the political field is changing. So somebody like Ted Cruz positioned himself as sort of the ultimate conservative Christian candidate. And you saw that he lost very, very badly. So the moment, say, of Christian politics has passed. But I think that Christian politics did produce sort of a disillusionment with, on the one hand, a certain type of Christianity. That's part of why we're seeing those developments. And on the other hand, that the usefulness or the effectiveness of Christian politics in politics, that the high moment has passed. But that doesn't necessarily mean people are getting less religious, but we're just seeing that there's a shift from, say, cultural politics to economic politics, a little simplistically.
Okay. And that makes the religious equation and who votes for whom more difficult to determine.
Of course. Yeah.
So that's, I think, it's added uncertainty to the field.
Yeah. Okay. Now you mentioned, you didn't mention the word, but that was part of the culture wars. Which we all read about in America during the 90s. Does that mean, and now we're going to the core of the matter, trying to find out to weigh the important factors in the rise of Trump. Is it the culture war, a remnant of the culture war, or, as Willem Post has been saying, more the economics, a kind of class war? So has the class war, in a way, replaced culture war in the United States? What do you think?
Yeah, I think I would tend to say it's a different culture war. I think it's a different. I think so. Things that seem to be playing a big role, for example, is urban versus rural. So cities are voting much more strongly Democratic, while rural regions are voting much more strongly for Trump. Education is playing a role, race is playing a role, gender is playing a role. And there's, for example, right now a very interesting debate going on in relation to Fox News. You had, I think it was just last night, or the last few days, you had this conflict between a host, one of the presenters on Fox News, Megyn Kelly, and Newt Gingrich. And the whole question of whether the issue of the ways in which Trump dealt with women, whether that was significant, or whether that was something that was taking our attention away from sort of the real issues. And so you're seeing a real divide opening up within conservatives.
What was Newt Gingrich saying? What was
Newt Gingrich was essentially saying, what he said to her is, Megyn, you know, you're obsessed with sex. And so then she corrected that. And so they had a very, very sharp conflict. And that's part of sort of a deeper lying development within the Fox News channel, but also more generally within the Republican Party. In relation to a host of issues. But so I think that issue of gender and how do we look, and gender politics, right, classically has been part of the culture wars.
Okay, so the culture war isn't finished, it has taken on a different shape. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think that the class-based way of thinking about it, as long as you understand the class-based, or, you know, that you're talking really about a much more decided shift between, you know, people who have, with different social outlooks, and that this is partly grounded in class. I think that's important, but it has all kinds of cultural, comes with all kinds of cultural effects. So in that sense, we are still talking about culture war. You know, one of the things I think where you can sort of say where the culture war becomes most evident is the so-called debate over political correctness. So, you know, you have this, it's, you know, what's politically correct, and this idea of, you know, we don't need to be politically correct. We've tired of that. I think that's the best example where you can say there's an older debate about what you know, about particular values and what you can say and what's, you know, what you can't say in the public realm. And that's tied to older culture wars, and that's now being carried over in this specific debate, and that's really about political correctness.
Is that a parallel with the situation in Holland, if you can compare these?
Yeah, yes, although...
because we have a big debate here as well.
Right, about, yeah, that's right, and I think it's a more restricted debate here. More restricted. I mean, that is to say, it's not as it's focused on a couple of issues.
Black Pete.
Yeah, Black Pete. Immigration, somewhat. You know, so
Islam.
But it's so there are things in which it sort of creeps into it. So in that sense, there's a kind of a parallel too. And this is, and it's not, it seems to me, a coincidence that there are parallels, because what essentially this notion of political correctness is, and that's why it's the issue, is because this shows again the divide between the elite and the people. You know, we have it's you know, it's the elite that's trying to tell people how they should think and how they should speak, and the people just are not going to take it anymore.
Yeah, I think what's a really important difference with the Netherlands is that in the US, you still have a strong section of the society, not just the elite, but a strong section that very explicitly affirms diversity, affirms multiculturalism, and is not just aghast at the tone that Trump uses, but also simply at his standpoint. And I think that's an important difference with the Netherlands, where we have gone through a period where pretty much everybody in the political spectrum repudiated multiculturalism, you know, said either we did it wrong, or, you know, it's dead, or it is not effective. So that's a huge difference, I think, with the US.
Okay, right. But the aversion to elites?
Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah. Then you have elites, you have the people, but also you have, in the middle, you might say, institutions. Trump has said some weeks ago already that he doesn't feel bound to respect the outcome of the election. Only if he wins, of course.
Well, that's reassuring in a way, too. But
because he won't win. But what does that tell you about the respect for institutions in American democracy? there wasn't a very big uproar, not among his voters. They cheered him up. Does that mean that you can become president of the United States, almost, and disrespect the institutions of democracy?
This is something we haven't seen for a long time. I mean, so this is something you have to go back to the very early years of the Republic before you can see somebody saying, "I'm not going to respect the outcome." I mean, I suppose you could say 1860 is that when Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States, you had southern states secede from the United States. So they, I don't know if it's that they didn't respect this, you know, or to say we don't accept the outcome. It's more they just didn't like the outcome and decided to try to leave. So this is something we haven't seen before. I think it goes down to, it is part of a kind of a populist stance. One of the striking things about Trump voters is it's not even so much the income level, it's the connection with the institutions of society, which is weaker. So these are people who just are just less connected in with neighborhood associations, with churches, with you know, philanthropic organizations, whatever. So these are people who have less ties there than others. So there's, I think, in that sense, a profound profound estrangement from institutions. And so I think that's also somehow what's feeding this, is that there really are no institutions that I know and that I respect. And that translates itself, obviously, I think, with disastrous, with likely disastrous effects in this stance that this whole political system is actually is one that is based on fraud and deception.
Yeah. Markha, that means that what James Kennedy is describing now is a segment of American society which has no communities, no sense of community in a way. So they get it from Trump. Trump provides them with a sense of community. Why haven't the Democrats been able to do the same?
Well, I think to some extent the Democrats are doing it with Obama.
Are doing the same?
You know, so yeah, and I don't know to what, I mean, I don't know if Trump gives people a sense of community or if he gives them a sense of there being a voice, somebody who is, I mean, you're seeing a real divide over how should we imagine America, and how should we imagine, you know, where we have come. So you see, for example, if you do surveys, then there's significant differences in terms of people thinking, you know, did we used to be better off or worse off? Are we going, you know, the future and all of that. So I think that's a more important divide.
The sense of community at Trump rallies is huge.
But I don't know if that's a sense of community or if that's a sense of I'm trying to remember now what Durkheim called that. You know, so you have a whole gathering, right? And in a certain sense, this is quite actually a religious experience in a way. You know, when you have a mass of people together, and he unleashes a whole set of emotions.
Well, Ronald Kagan, whose piece you know, of course, called it fascism.
Yeah, I mean,
he wrote it's a controversial piece, but he wrote, "This is the way fascism, in a way, comes to America." Would you agree?
Yeah, I don't see that happening at the moment, in the sense of that I don't think you have the whole structural apparatus of fascism. So, I mean, what Trump, you can save me anytime you feel like. So, you know, but I mean, because okay, it's no, I don't agree. I don't agree with that. This is fascism coming to America.
It's an extreme point of view, but
no. But what I would say is, what I see coming to America is you see that the political parties, in fact, are disintegrating, and I think it's much more something like that. In particular, I mean, in different kinds of ways. So you have the political parties are coalitions. The Republican Party now is having significant ruptures in the kinds of coalitions that they've had between Christians and businessmen and racists and so forth. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that the kinds of connections that you have that hold the political system together between funders, middlemen in the party, and the political party elite, there have been a whole new set of rules put in place that make those more difficult. So I go much more actually with that kind of a structural analysis. Let's look at how the political system is working. And right now we're being faced with a crisis, but I don't think a crisis is the same as fascism is coming.
Okay. You saved yourself, but maybe James Kennedy wants to.
Yes, well, no, I would. You saved yourself very nicely, Markha, on the fascism thing. I would not. I don't think that fascism is also the best way to describe this. I mean, you can talk about the fascistoid tendencies, things that look like fascism, things that resemble it, without necessarily having to talk about whole hog fascism. Which I do think requires a different kind of structure. I mean, I think there are things you can be concerned about. I think you can say that there's I think there's a disturbingly authoritarian impulse that we see here. You know, that I think bodes ill for democracy if it's given much room. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which you can talk about this being a bad political development without you having to resort to seeing, you know, a kind of unstructured, wild populism of this kind being the same as the return of fascism, which is also an argument, as you know, that is made not just about Donald Trump, but about other European populist leaders.
Yeah. Okay, right. I have two more questions, and then we'll give the floor to the audience to round it up. We're on the eve of the election, so what do you think will happen, if you can give a short preview, if Donald Trump wins and if he doesn't win? Which one of the two scenarios is most disconcerting?
Well, to start on the bright side, if Donald Trump wins, we really don't know how bad it will be. So it's. No, I mean, it's possible that you're going to, I mean, it may turn out all right. I mean, if you have, you know, in a certain sense, people get used to him grandstanding, that he shows relatively little interest or inclination or discipline for the affairs of government, and that he lets other people do that for him.
Then he'll be Ronald Reagan.
Then you could have a, well, I don't know if you'd ever have a Ronald Reagan out of him, but you'd have somebody that, I don't think it's ever going to be a great president, but you can say it's a president who, through his lack of ability, will be compelled to let other people do things. But of course, it could also be, you know, the other possibility is global thermal nuclear war. You know, you know, it's really between these two possibilities. We don't really, we really don't know how that's going to turn out. You know, so this is the scary thing. It's not about that there's a blueprint, because we do not know policies-wise what the blueprint will be. So in that sense, it's very, very difficult to prognosticate about what's going to happen in that event.
What will happen if Trump loses the election, Markha, do you think?
Yeah. Can I add something to Trump winning? Well, because I think there's two things that's important. One is that in terms of the unpredictability, it also creates certain kinds of possibilities. So we have, so if you, for example, look at the U.S. commitment to Israel, right, or U.S. relations to Russia, he's made very, very clear that he's not interested in abiding by sort of what has been our operating procedure, what have we established, and that can be incredibly disruptive, it can be very dangerous, but it also can mean that we explore possibilities that we don't. It almost sounds like I'm for Trump. I'm not. No, but I think, that's why people have been interested in him. So in terms of getting at why is it that people are voting for him? They're voting for him precisely because he says, you know, I am not, you know, abiding by what the Republican Party stands for. I'm not abiding by what the Democrats stand for. I'm my own man. And I think that is one of the things that's appealing. And for particular reasons, because in certain regards, of course, when you have an established system, right, it limits room for maneuver in all kinds of ways. So he opens things up. I think another thing that's important is that in terms of how he performs, his big problem is that he's acting like a CEO, and he doesn't know how to act like a political leader. So he's used to commanding rather than persuading. Question is, can he learn to do that? So I think when he sees that something isn't effective, he's very interested in learning. You've seen how he's tried to adapt his debating style. It doesn't last for more than 30 minutes, right? But
in the clip he says, if I do something wrong, I'll try to do it better next time. I don't apologize.
You see, I mean, in the end, he wants to make it work. He wants to win. People thought it was a joke, right? But he has got. People thought he would never last. Right? And yet he has persisted. So there is a certain kind of drive. He's extremely status conscious. He does not want to make a fool of himself. Still, there's the thermonuclear possibility. And what if he loses? So there's different kinds of scenarios. So one scenario is that, in fact, there's a landslide for Hillary Clinton. The Democrats get the Senate. They also turn, half of the seats in the House. And that means that the Democrats get tremendous momentum and can really achieve a number, or come close to, or have a possibility, right, of achieving at least some of the policies that Hillary Clinton would want.
Will Trump supporters accept the outcome of the election?
I think
there was a slight hint of violence threatening.
Yeah, a hint of violence. Well, I think there are two scenarios. I mean, and both of them are bad, because I think both are likely to come out to some extent. One is that you can sort of say there's a direct violent response. That people say we've been robbed, and we're going to violently, or at least beyond the bounds of law, protest against what has happened. I don't think that's the most likely outcome, but that's one outcome. I think a more likely outcome, and not a particularly better one, is that you have people who say, okay, it's proven this system is rigged because we knew we were going to win, and there is no reason to have any confidence in this system anymore, even less than the shreds we now have. And that means that we will hunker down, we will create alternate societies, we'll be even more strongly fed by media that tell us that this has been robbed, and we will be in a permanent state of alienation from the U.S. political system. There is, in that sense, no hope that any constructive contribution to it can be made possible. That also can lead to forms of political quietism. People say, well, I'm just done, so I just don't want to do anything more. My man lost, so I'm not interested in politics anymore. But it can also mean that you're really talking about a significant part of the population that is dangerously alienated from American politics and society too, perhaps. Because
then you're talking about 1/3 to maybe half of the...
No. But then we're talking about, for these hardcore, we're talking 10 to 20% of the population.
And I think the key thing then, because I think that's the real key thing. So like, let's assume Hillary Clinton's going to win. She'll win either with 4% or with a landslide, but she'll win in some fashion. And then I think the key thing is the question of, are there going to be organizations and people that emerge who are going to be trying to mobilize? So Donald Trump is talking about setting up his own television channel. You have Breitbart News. You have the alt-right. So you have a number of media platforms in place. You have a number of potential leaders. If those work together in order to congeal and mobilize the people that James is talking about, then I think we could have a real problem. If instead that doesn't happen, right, then you have that I think most of them will be quietists, most of them will withdraw, will feel deeply alienated. But that means, in fact, actually that a large proportion is going to go back to where they had been before Trump came along.
Okay, right. Have you already voted?
Yeah.
Sent your vote?
Yeah.
Apart from your political views, on which candidate would you put your money right now?
You mean Hillary Clinton, who has like an 80 to 85% chance of winning, or Donald Trump, who has...
It changes every hour.
Yeah, but not so extremely that...
Okay.
No, I mean, I have no crystal ball that gives me deeper insights than the polls. The polls seem to suggest that there will be a reasonably comfortable Hillary Clinton victory. But of course, we've never seen an election like this, and we don't know, as Willem Post has indicated, we don't know what those recent investigations by the FBI will mean.
Okay. Final question to you, and it's a question I put to Willem Post. Is the American dream dead?
No.
Not a no-yes answer, please.
Okay. Well, you have less mobility than you have in Western Europe now, and I think that is
less than in Europe now.
Yeah, in Western Europe. So that is a very, very striking development, because it used to be for a long, long time, right? You went from Europe to the United States, for example, precisely because of the possibilities of that kind of mobility. That's what my own family went through. You know, going from coal miners to university. You know, within one generation. So, you know, it has stood for, with all its shortcomings and the tremendous amount of poverty and violence and discrimination that are embedded in the society, right? It's always had at the same time, certainly for white immigrants, it's had tremendous possibilities. And though that's changing right now. At the same time, I think it's built into the DNA of the U.S. Okay. And
U.S. scores 23rd right now of 176 countries in terms of social mobility among young people, among young adults. So that is, in fact, the 22 countries ahead of it, including many countries in Western Europe.
Is Holland ahead?
I think it's number 6 in the world when it comes to measuring social mobility. I think it is an indication of some serious problems in American society. But again, you know, it's an American dream is that. There was a poll done years ago about, and then we should close. There was a poll done years ago about asking Americans what percentage of them felt they had made the American dream. And this was about 20 years ago. Harper's did it. And 6% of those who made over $100,000 a year said they had made the American dream. And they polled people people who had made less than $15,000 a year, and 5% of them said they had made the American dream. You can see that American dream is also a state of mind.
Okay.
So.
Well, thank you, Markha Valenta and James Kennedy. And I'd like to give the floor to you if you have some questions. There is a microphone available, so please ask for the microphone and stand up and put a question to our panelists. I see a question over there. Do you want to fill a post?
Yeah.
Hi.
Sorry?
Yeah. Hi. My name is Petra Stienen. I'm a Dutch politician. I'm on behalf of the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe. I will be an election observer. I know everybody in this audience now being very jealous, or not. And I'm going actually to your home state, to New Mexico. So so I'm wondering two things. Any advice on websites or media outlets you would advise us and me to look for where I can get relatively objective news on the elections while I'm in the US? Okay. And two, what would you be looking for if I go for election observing in your home state, driving around? We're going in Albuquerque. Because obviously there are these things, the rumors by some politicians, one of them we've discussed tonight, that they might be rigged.
Okay, so any more questions for professional advice, then you can put them to Mark.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because I was born in New Mexico, but like lots of Americans, I've moved around a lot. So at a certain later date, I also again lived in New Mexico, but actually the state that I vote in is Iowa, because that's where I lived last. So I think in terms of objective news, I know that I think for many Dutch, the ways in which many newspapers now have become very strongly politicized is a bit frustrating and goes too far. I think what I've heard is The Hill. I think that lots of that Dutch scholars like The Hill as a site where they feel like they can, maybe you have a couple more. And yeah, about where to go in New Mexico, I don't know. It's been too long since I've been there.
I was making a joke, but can I specify?
Yeah.
The whole idea of elections being rigged We think about this when we look at certain countries in...
Yeah. Oh, but I think that's, I mean, say in the US, to my sense right now, where that's playing out the most has to do with voter registration, So you have in a number of areas, but as far as I know, that's not an issue playing in New Mexico. It's playing in a number of other states. In terms of, voter ID laws, voter registration, and you have, I forget, was it North or South Carolina? You have a state, for example, where the court said that the kinds of rules that they were applying were not constitutional, and yet they were still continuing to apply them. So I think that area, that is a very serious, it's a serious area of contention, and that also is an area where people are concerned. There was a moment also where there was some concern, right, about, are Trump supporters going to be coming and intimidating others? I don't, right now I'm thinking that won't be a too serious issue in too many places.
But you might want to try southern New Mexico. You want to try some of the border towns in southern Mexico where there are lots of Latino voters who apparently have registered in heightened numbers, and that might be an area where people who want to will think that there will be forms of voting fraud taking place there.
Okay.
So that would be just a.
Let me take the opportunity to ask Willem Post, who's still in the audience, to come over here. No, I'll stand up.
No, stay. Okay, and we have another chair.
Because you can put your questions also to him, of course. Chair? There was a question here in front.
Oh, you have it?
We have till about 10 o'clock. So.
I'm
Thank you.
a paper reader in Holland. And well, I'm very worried about the whole situation in the United States. And I wonder if I think the Republican Party has made a mess of the whole thing. And is it not started when they have been so negative and opposing Obama all the time? And well, I see in the United States there are now women, Republican women who want to vote for Hillary, and they say we are for working together and not doing nothing together. So maybe.
So you're asking if the Republican Party is being punished in a way?
Yeah,
for confronting Obama.
Yes, they are.
Okay, who wants to respond? Maybe Willem?
Yeah, well, that's one of the big complaints, that both parties are doing a lousy job. And, well, the Congress, there are opinion polls showing that 80% or more of the American citizens think that this is really the do-nothing Congress. And that's a big shame, because one of the real pillars underneath U.S. democracy is, of course, the Congress itself. So there you have it, this whole crisis. It's some sort of. I listen to you two, of course, and it sounds rather pessimistic what you're saying. But sometimes you don't like it if we are pessimistic.
But put a follow-up question: is Obama to blame partly for the rise of Trumpism? To blame?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, I mean, yes, through. I mean, in two ways. In one way that you can say. For who he is and what he represents. And there we can talk also about the racism in American society, and that the fact that this is in partly a backlash to a black president. So that's part of it. So to call him to blame, that's not really exactly the right term in that respect. In another way, it is, I think, that there is a kind of, Barack Obama has not, in all respects, been a great politician. It's not somebody who's, in that sense, has lacked, in a certain sense, the kind of a Clintonian sort of nosy of being able to, be friendly and reach out and make deals.
He's a cool president.
He's a cool president who is not a very good negotiator and not very good in the legislative process as a whole. So in that sense, I think also in his coolness, there has been sometimes, I think, a communication of a kind of a moral superiority about what he's done, and I think that means that It means that he symbolizes for many people government overreach. I think that argument's overstated about government overreach, but that this seems to be somebody who has been inattentive to the fineries of the Constitution, as somebody who's wanted to maximize in bad ways the impact of government. And he's also talked disparagingly about also conservative voters in a kind of elitist way. And in these ways, he's not always been the right president to make the tensions we're talking about diminish.
He didn't call them deplorables.
No, well, that's Hillary Clinton. But he would talk about the statement about also they clutch their religion and their guns, and so there's in that sense there is a kind of a.
I partly agree and disagree, because
there's a question back there, but.
Yeah, but
if you want to defend Obama,
maybe a very short comment, because you're right, he's not a Lyndon Johnson-like politician or a Bill Clinton-like politician, and making all kinds of deals in the Congress and walking in the corridors of the Congress. So you're right on that. But on the other hand, it was from day on that you had this Republican opposition, Mr. Boehner saying no act of this new President Obama will pass through Congress. So that's already a sign of a very, very early rise of polarization. And by the way, this whole process of polarization started already, I think, in the Reagan years, and it's stronger and stronger. And thank God Obama was a rather cool guy when we had the worst economic situation since the 30s. And we can talk a lot about this, of course, but that's on the plus side of this president, I would say.
Markha, there's a question back there, but if you want to defend Obama in one sentence, you have the floor. Do you want to add something?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think also relative to what James said is, I think you do have a back and forth reaction, you have a dynamic reaction, but I think it was very, very clear, the Republicans made very clear that they were going to create a united front in attempting to block Obama, whatever it would take. And in response to that, Obama explored and very effectively deployed alternative ways of achieving. And I can imagine that, and that's where that argument of overreach comes from. But I think it's important to understand sort of where that that practice came. And I mean, he was also, but. Yeah.
That's right. No, I agree. I mean, he had, of course, been president for his first 2 years was with the Democratic Congress. And I think some of that feeling the Republicans had at that time also came with the way that they felt they were treated in that democratically controlled thing. So, and you're just saying, of course, I mean, so when it comes to these enmities, it's hard to sort of lay the blame on one side or the other. I think the Republicans had the greater share of this, but I just don't want to say that, it's not just that Barack Obama is the innocent victim of their predations.
We're running out of time, so there's a question. If there are any more questions, I'd like to have them. You raise your hands now, otherwise, the lady over there and back there.
Okay. Hi. I want to get back to the gender issue. It seems that Trump has, well, for his detractors, he sort of blundered his way through the campaign with one, awful remark after another. And everything seemed to pass by him, except these findings of sexism, of old things that he said. They're not even that recent. They're not even spoken by him while he was running already.
What's your question?
My question is, isn't a fear of women the elephant in the room here, the pink elephant, that is truly upsetting both parties? Actually, the whole world.
Because it was really his voice and what he said on these audio tapes, that's almost a crime. It's almost a proof in a judicial case. I mean, it is his voice, and that's different than saying all these nasty things to Hillary. These are only words, but this is between words and deeds on the audio tapes, and then a lot of people were shocked.
Why would that be a scandal? We all know about Kennedy's house.
Okay, let Markha respond to that.
Yeah, well, I think we know about Kennedy after the fact. I think that's very, very important. So, and it's long after the fact. And we didn't have, we don't have tapes, even today, as far as I know, we don't have tapes of Kennedy bragging that he's violating women. And I think that was the big difference with Trump, is he was bragging of doing things to women against their will. So that was, and so these are very clearly, if this would get established, in a court of law and so forth, right? It's actionable. It could go to court, and we don't know what would be the outcome, because those are always complicated processes. But he was bragging about actions he had taken, which are illegal. You're not allowed to sexually assault someone.
Don't you agree that the amount of women protesting in general in public life against harassment, against sexism, is bigger than it ever was before? Isn't there a difference?
I don't know if... Well, but a lot happened between the 50s and now. So, I mean, I came of age, when I was at university in the 1980s in the United States, and feminism was very, very strong. And, there were issues about relations between students and professors. There were issues about date rape. There were issues about sexual violence. There were women's centers being set up. There were call lines being set up. So the issue of violence against women has been an issue of ongoing concern, of public debate, of politicization, the ways in which the Republicans have been dealing with issues of reproduction, and the kinds of public debate that has created in terms of the invasive legislation of women's bodies that has been proposed by some conservatives. And I could go on, but I think this is, so I think it's been an ongoing issue, rather than that I would say that it's now stronger than it was 20, 30 years ago.
Okay, thank you. Do you think Trump will turn back Roe versus Wade if he gets to be elected?
I don't think he has any interest in that.
Okay.
Well, this is again what's his relationship with the Republican Senate going to be, and who's going to negotiate, what kind of candidate it's going to be. Again, we don't know what kind of process that will be, and will he accede to the request, or will he choose his own candidate, and what kind of candidate will that be? No idea.
I think if it's useful to him, he'll show an interest.
He changed 5 times his position on abortion.
Right. Final question for the lady over there.
Hi. So the polarization between Democrats and Republicans seems to be sterilizing American politics by limiting the choice to always 2 camps. Do you foresee any rise for a third alternative in the next few years?
I do. It's a great question. Yeah, I do. I do think that is something that the alienation, and again, as Markha has talked about the disintegration of parties, that's going to offer some new opportunities for people to think about what that would look like. These 2 parties, of course, are deeply embedded in the power structures of American society. In that sense, they have everything. They would rather have this system continue to have serious dysfunction as long as they continue to be the only 2 providers of services. So these are parties that will not easily go away. But I do think, we're talking about moments, when there seems to be political vacuum, who will then take, is there effective leadership in the party? And then we can see in the 2 parties. And then if that's not the case, we can talk about political entrepreneurs coming in and offering. It's happened, obviously, in American history before. I mean, there have been actually third-party movements that have been obviously not ultimately successful, but they have existed, and it's possible that this will, and also this experience of profound alienation will, in the next 10 years, have some kind of effect.
Is Trump in a way a one-man third party?
He's, I think, indicated that he's shown the relativity of the Republican Party.
And if he will lose, then I think there's a real chance that there will come some sort of a reckoning now. And already we've seen the big differences between Mr. Ryan, Paul Ryan in the Congress, a very well-respected conservative leader, and now already some sort of revolt against him. And when he will lose Trump, I think he will try to mobilize, energize these anti-Republican establishment forces, and then with these millions of voters behind him, Trump will never stop, I think. And then it's not only a movement, it could turn out to be an independent, some sort of a populist Republican Party.
Okay. Markha, final words.
Well, I think just to qualify, because I think for lots of Dutch people, there's a sense like because there's only two parties, and maybe also for a lot of Americans who are feeling very frustrated with the system. But the thing that's important is that the political parties that you have actually are coalitions that function together in a much more loose way than Dutch political parties do, for example. I don't know where you're coming from, but say relative to Europe. And for example, it's not at all uncommon for people to vote for candidates from both parties at different levels. So they might vote for a Democratic president and a Republican senator, and somebody else for governor and so forth. So it's so that gives you a lot more flexibility than if you would just be consistently with one political party. So in different kinds of, it's a complicated discussion, but there's actually more flexibility built into the system than you might think when you're watching it from a distance. And the polarization that you see, to some extent it's throughout society, but to some extent also it is most strongly focused within the political elite. And you see that precisely because people do split-ticket voting and so forth. So it's a bit more flexible maybe, and there's perhaps more possibilities than might seem.
Okay, that's great.
Ik denk dat bijna iedereen Nederlands spreekt. Ik wil één opmerking maken. Het is bijna een televisieprogramma wat we hebben meegemaakt. Ik had veel meer verwacht dat het publiek iets had mogen zeggen, iets had mogen vragen. 3 of 4 vragen gesteld. Vind ik heel jammer.
Okay.
Dit hadden we ook vanavond weer bij de Wereld Draait Door kunnen zien. Of waar dan ook.
But if you have a question, please put it.
Ja, nee. Nee, ik heb verder geen specifieke vragen, maar ik vind het jammer dat het publiek zo weinig aandacht heeft.
Well, we can take 1 or 2 more questions if there are any.
Please, you can't criticize that the public doesn't get a chance, and then you're given a chance and you don't ask a question. That's very passive, please.
No? If there aren't any questions, please feel free, but if there aren't any...
Because I know there was a question over there. I saw the woman second, I don't know if you want me to single you out, but there was a question sort of on the edge. Somebody who's now, right there, sitting behind the gentleman in front.
I don't know if
there was, okay.
wants to be put on the spot.
It's more the question about the appointment of the Supreme Court. And I think we've just had that question, or the answer, the evangelicals and their voter preference. Wayne Grudem said, well, I can back up Trump, even though what he said on the bus was disgusting. It's about the policies, not the person. How many, what part of the evangelical voters do you think, or you can't look into a crystal ball, would say the same, that it's not about the person, it's about the policies, and we think the whole debate about the Supreme Court is more important than Trump.
Wayne Grudem is a leading evangelical leader who had signed on to Trump, and then after this tape in the Florida bus, then backtracked and says, I'm not going to vote him, I'm not going to support him. So the question is, how many evangelical... And then he went back again, and he was pressured by it, so now where does he actually stand? I think that my guess is that what you're going to... that's, of course, one of the great questions. Systematically, 80% of evangelicals voted for John McCain. 80% voted for Mitt Romney. So that's a relatively, or 78%. So it's a relatively stable number. I think all anticipations are is that number is going to be down. It's going to be down to, and then nobody really knows. But, I think people are talking about notions of 65 to 70% of evangelicals voting for Trump. It's a guess on the basis of what people say. So they're going to vote. So that still sounds like a lot. Let's say 2/3 of evangelicals voting for Donald Trump. But again, given that they're unlikely to vote for Hillary Clinton for policy reasons, it's a significant drop. And that's one of the things that concern Republicans down list, as it's called, so because are these evangelical voters going to show up and vote for other Republicans? But this is one of the exciting questions. What's that voter bloc going to do? And so we anticipate a significant but modest drop in the rate of support for the Republican presidential candidate.
Okay, let me put the final question remark again. Nobody? Then
lady there.
Over there?
In the back.
Over there?
Yes. But the microphone is coming. Help is coming.
In the whole discussion this evening, I've never heard the word debt, state debt mentioned. And is there any indication, whichever candidate wins, who will be the most qualified to deal with the whole huge debt that the United States has, the whole money system?
Okay.
Well, if we look at the economic and financial programs of the candidates, well, Mr. Trump is offering tax reductions quite spectacular. It's now the top income tax bracket is 39%, just a little bit under the 40, and he is proposing now bringing it back to 33, and the other two brackets, middle class and lower, also a huge tax reduction. And so there's a hole in the U.S. budget. There is a Washington-based think tank that studied the consequences of these financial programs. And this is campaign time, and the economy is growing a bit, so you have a little bit more flexibility. But anyway, this is really a financial problem if Mr. Trump realizes this tax program. Apart from the tariff barriers against China, what also has a very, very big influence on the economy, of course. Mrs. Clinton is proposing a $275 billion infrastructure plan, the cracking bridges and roads, the whole infrastructure, it has to be repaired. But also not that many details. Well, more details than in the Trump program, but that's also a little bit of a problem. And this Washington-based think and research tank also draw the conclusion that under Clinton's budget, there also will be a bigger debt, but less than Donald Trump, as you might expect. But this is campaign time, and it can easily change when they're in the White House. But anyway, it's a rather risky financial scheme they are presenting us.
Okay, any of you have an economic preference as to debt solving? Or who will be able to do it better?
Well, Hillary is the master of policy, so...
Yeah.
She has always more details, as we know. Well, she's a dossier person.
Okay. You mean there's debt, national debt, and there's deficit, and what's going to be done about the government deficit, or what's going to be done about national debt?
I'm thinking more of debt.
Yeah, the debt.
And it just doesn't, from what I've heard, it doesn't seem to be discussed very much. There's no focus on it anywhere.
It's a pity in the campaign that they are not talking that much on these issues. No, it's all about personal insults and image building and trying to destroy each other. That's a big complaint. Or a lot of, well, a little.
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Here, right at the end.
Am I allowed to have a final question?
Yeah. You are, sir. You are. You are.
You are the.
Do you think when? Sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh. When Trump becomes in power, and he decides to have a bump on North Korea, will they obey them then? Will the soldiers obey them to do that?
I think probably so. I think the real question would be, where it would come down, a more likely scenario. I don't even want to think about that question about what's going to happen in respect to the nuclear option. I think a more fundamental question would be, for example, let's suppose that Trump says we need to go back to waterboarding, we need to go back to forms of torture. what then are American soldiers or the Central Intelligence Agency going to do? And my guess is that they'll probably resist. That would be my anticipation that they would do that. I'm not saying it wouldn't happen, but I would imagine there would be institutional resistance to do that just because they've been there. And apart from the inhumanity of the practice, I just don't think they want to be placed in that position again in terms of their institutional future.
Well, very short. There are already a few U.S. generals who months ago already came in the news saying, well, of course, the U.S. president is our supreme commander, but I also have my pledge to the security of the American people as a general. So there is some sort of space in between, and it's a very scary situation, as we all know, and let's keep it to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what's important is that in the American political system and the socio-political system, there are a lot more possibilities for obstruction built into it than in the Dutch system. So I know, you know, with my students, but also other commentators, often they find the American system very inefficient, very frustrating, because the system was put together on purpose so that precisely that could not happen, that you could have one center of power that then could sort of take over the system.
Yeah, but
and it's built, I think it's built into the culture much more.
I understand what you're saying, but I'm not really agreeing with you because, of course, checks and balances and your advisors. But on the other hand, the president in the field of security has a lot of room to maneuver. He can send his troops.
But he needs Congress to work with him,
You have the War Powers Act. You can have the troops for 60 days where you want them as a president, as a supreme commander. And you don't have to consult Congress after 60 days, the War Powers Act. But if there is a sudden crisis, well, Hillary said it in one of the debates. It's only about 4 minutes. When it's really a sudden nuclear crisis, I agree. We think it will never happen. We are using our common sense. But with this Mr. Trump, to be honest, and his temperament, you never know in what kind of adventures he will bring us. So I think it's really a nightmare scenario, and don't underestimate.
I think that one's much less likely. See, so I think, yes, the extreme, I don't also...
He is the boss. The spotlight is on him, eh?
Right, so I don't want to think of the ultimate extreme example and what would Trump do. But I think it's much more realistic to think of a kind of in-between scenario. Say he has a conflict with Putin. Say he has a conflict with Erdogan.
Even when it's a 0.1% chance that this will get out of control, and here you have it. Well, we have the examples, the Cuba crisis, well, some other crisis. So,
well, yet on the other hand, the president-elect who has said that he won't respect the outcome of the election he can't count on much respect coming his side either.
But you know what the real scary thing is, in my view? Well, there are many scary things concerning Mr. Trump, to be honest. This is a guy we know for 30 years, 35 years. He has never listened to his advisors. He's very proud to say, well, they're listening to me. And imagine the most important political job in the world. I think we all agree on this, but we are tolerant people, basically, I think, sitting here, raised in democracies. We are using our intellect and thinking, well, we are relativists, it will never happen. But here you have Mr. Trump. We know his whole history. Such a guy in the White House. Well, I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, and there I talked with a lot of Democrats. Well, it's Washington, D.C. And when I said, well, in the Netherlands, we are a bit scary about this Mr. Trump. And then, well, they all said, you can imagine how scary we are. More people are going to the doctor. And of course it will not happen. Of course it will never happen. And it will all turn out to be... No,
I can affirm what Willem Post is saying. As a final note, unless there is one more very urgent question.
That's a good question.
I can affirm what you're saying because a friend of mine just came back from a holiday in Utah.
Oh, well.
And he was there for the first and second debate. And he and his girlfriend drove around for hundreds of miles trying to find a bar where they could watch the debate. But none of the bars they frequented showed the debate. They were afraid riots.
Well, yeah, here,
and
there you have
arguments.
it.
Yeah.
So that's a bit scary.
Okay.
The latest news is, by the way, that this whole Clinton
Still latest
email.
news.
Yeah, but I checked. I was sitting there. That the FBI found something. Well, it's not a joke on the mobile or social device of Mr. Do you know him, Anthony Weiner?
Yeah. What did they find?
They didn't say what exactly, but you know, Anthony Weiner married to Yuma the second daughter of Hillary Clinton.
Let's not get into it.
It's still vague, but that was the latest. Well,
maybe we can explain afterwards.
I'll do it afterwards.
Thanks for the update.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention and questions. And thank you. I'd like to have a big round of applause for Markha Valenta, Willem Post, and James Kennedy.
Yeah.